Once upon a time, a brother and sister named Hansel and Gretel lived in a faraway land. They didn't have a mother, and their father was a poor woodcutter. They lived all together in the forest. One day, their father married another woman. This woman came from a rich family, and therefore she didn't like her husband to be poor. She always complained about living in an old cottage in the woods and barely making both ends meet. She also didn't like her stepchildren at all. She wanted to get rid of them somehow. First, she tried to convince her husband to send the children away. But the father loved Hansel and Gretel very much, therefore he didn't accept. Hansel, however, heard this discussion and understood that their stepmother didn't want them. After that day, he started to watch his stepmother more carefully. Hansel was a very smart child, but when their father didn't agree to send the children away, the stepmother made another plan. She wanted to get rid of Hansel and Gretel at any cost. One day, she thought of taking the children deep into the forest and leaving them there. They were children after all, and they wouldn't be able to find the way back home and get lost, she thought. The next day, when her husband left, she started to implement her plan. She called Hansel and Gretel and said they would go on a walk in the forest. Hansel immediately understood what their stepmother was planning. He secretly filled his pockets with rocks before leaving the house. They started walking in the forest, and as they walked, Hansel started dropping the rocks he had collected. They went deep into the forest. When their mother was sure that the children wouldn't be able to find their way back home, she told them to stop. She told them to rest for a while and lit a fire for them. "I will collect some flowers and come back. You wait here until I return," she said, and left the children. And then she returned to their house as fast as she could. Hansel and Gretel were left in the middle of the forest, all alone. They waited for their stepmother until it started to get dark. But when the fire died and the night fell, Hansel understood that their stepmother left them there. So he took Gretel, and following the rocks that he had dropped, he found the way back home. At this moment, their stepmother was telling their father that Hansel and Gretel had disregarded her warnings and got lost in the forest. At this instant, the children entered the cottage. The father, seeing his children, was overjoyed and hugged them tightly. The stepmother, on the other hand, couldn't believe her eyes. How did they find the way back home, she thought. Next day, she decided to try the same plan again. But this time, she would take the children even deeper into the woods. This way, she wanted to make sure that Hansel and Gretel wouldn't be able to find their way back home. As they were leaving, she noticed Hansel filling his pockets with the rocks. Then she understood that Hansel was dropping the rocks behind them as they went into the forest, and then followed these rocks to find the way back home. So, she scolded Hansel and demanded him to empty his pockets. Hansel had no choice, so he put the rocks back where he took them. All together, they walked deep into the forest. When they were deep in the forest again, their mother lit a fire and told them to wait for her by the fire. Hansel asked her, "You will come back, won't you?" And she replied, "Of course I will come back. I will just go and collect some fruit for you to eat. You stay here so I can find you when I come back." Hansel answered, "You didn't come back yesterday. What if you don't come back again?" The stepmother lied. "Yesterday, I couldn't find you when I came back, so now you should wait for me until I return." Hansel had no choice but to believe his stepmother. After leaving the children, the stepmother quickly returned home. Hansel and Gretel, on the other hand, started waiting for the return of their stepmother. They waited, waited, and waited, but nobody came. The night fell and wolves started to howl in the woods. Gretel was very scared, and Hansel hugged his sister and tried to calm her. But as the night progressed, he understood that their stepmother had left them there alone again. The children were really lost this time. For 3 days and 3 nights they wandered in the woods, hungry and trembling with fear. On the 3rd day, they spotted a white bird on a tree branch. The voice of the bird was very beautiful, and with its beautiful voice, it sang for the children. So the children forgot all about their hunger and started following the bird. The bird led them to a strange cottage. The walls of the cottage were made of bread, the roof made of cake, and the windows were made of candy. The children forgot about all their troubles and ran to the house. Hansel started to eat the roof, and Gretel started to eat the windows. At this instant, a voice was heard from inside the house. "Who is eating my house?" Hansel and Gretel were surprised to see a very sweet old lady at the door. Come in," she said, inviting them inside the cottage. Hansel and Gretel entered and ate many wonderful foods that they had never tasted before. That night, they slept in beds with pillows full of bird feathers. But in the morning, everything changed. The old woman was actually a witch who built her cottage out of bread and cake to lure children into her trap. When the magic was lifted, the cottage suddenly returned to its old and dirty state. The witch held Hansel by his hair and lifted him off the bed and locked him inside a barn. Then she came back and took Gretel to the kitchen, pulling her hair. "Your brother is all skin and bones," she said. "Cook for him, fatten him up. When he's plump and nice, he will be a delicious meal for me. But you will not eat anything. He will eat all the food." Gretel was very sad. She cried and cried, but there was nothing she could do. She had to do what the witch said. Fortunately, Hansel decided to trick the witch, who had poor eyesight. Every morning, the witch checked Hansel's finger to find out if he was plump enough. So, instead of his finger, Hansel held a chicken bone for the witch to check. "Not plump enough," the witch would scream. She would go to the kitchen and tell Gretel to cook more food. This lasted for a month. In the end, the witch ran out of patience. "I don't care, plump or not. I will cook a Hansel pie today," she screamed at Gretel. "Check the oven. Is the dough ready?" Gretel was very scared, but she had to find some way to trick the witch like Hansel did. She understood that the witch was going to push her into the oven. "I can't fit my head in the oven. I can't see the dough," she said. The witch quickly pushed Gretel aside and put her head in the oven. Gretel pushed the old witch into the oven with all her strength and closed the lid behind her. So, Hansel was saved. But they still didn't know how to return home. They came to the forest and kept walking, not knowing which way to go. They walked and walked and walked. Then they heard their father's voice, calling for them. Suddenly, their father appeared in front of them. Actually, he was looking for the children since their stepmother told him that the children were lost. They hugged each other, joyful to be together again. Hansel told their father how their stepmother left them in the forest. The father understood the stepmother's plan. When they returned home together, he sent the woman away. No one should do such bad things, he said. And the family's troubles came to an end. They lived happily ever after.